Now, the Vienna Circle was the group that founded logical positivism. They were a group that formed in the city of Vienna shortly after World War I, and they were comprised mostly of German and Austrian philosophers. They were actually originally called the Ernst Mach Society, in tribute to the man who gave us the metric for the speed of sound, Mach 1, Mach 2, etc. They were particularly interested in the developments in science, the work of Albert Einstein most notably, developments in mathematical logic, in particular the work of David Hilbert and later on Bertrand Russell, and work in the philosophy of language, in particular the work of the young Ludwig Wittgenstein. They sort of wanted to combine all of these fields of study, mathematical logic, philosophy of language, and modern science, to create a new approach to philosophy. Probably the best way to understand what the Vienna Circle and logical positivism were after when you contrast them with their arch nemesis, the school of thought known as German Idealism. German Idealism was dominant throughout most of 19th century Europe, and in particular in Germany and Austria, where the Vienna Circle got together. Two sort of exemplars of this approach, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Martin Heidegger. They completely detested Hegel and Heidegger for various reasons. Hegel, for one, is horribly obscure, perplexing, and obtuse. Reading Hegel is the most complicated philosophy I know out there. Much of his work is incomprehensible, even to people who have trained in studying Hegel's work. Hegel is just incredibly obtuse. That's not to say that he's worthless, although the logical positivist thought he was worthless. But for me, while I think he has some important insights, he does not do himself any favors in the clarity department. He really is just really hard to understand. And something similar, although perhaps not quite as bad, with Martin Heidegger. Heidegger, strictly speaking, not a German idealist, but rather a phenomenologist and an existentialist, but these things derive in many ways from German idealism. But the way he expresses his philosophy makes it really, really hard to get a handle on. So what the Vienna Circle wanted to do, again, kind of like what Locke wanted to do, let's get rid of all this rubbish. Philosophy gets a bad name because they're so abstruse. So instead, let's place a high premium on clarity, on precision, on making sure that we understand exactly what we're talking about. One motto, I think it was Moritz Schlick's motto, the founder of the Vienna Circle, was, the ideal in philosophy is to die without anyone needing to interpret your meaning. Because they will know exactly what it is that you were trying to say, because that's how well you stated it in your writing. This idealism of the Germans, this mysticism which came along with a lot of this, the romanticism, and of course the nationalism which would lead to the Nazis in World War II. These were the sort of targets of the Vienna Circle. They wanted to do away with these things, with mysticism, romanticism, nationalism, and German idealism, and they wanted instead to replace it with a scientific approach to philosophy. What distinguishes logical positivism from sort of classical empiricism? And it's probably best understood in terms of the philosophy of language. They had a very particular view on the nature of human language, and 2 points that they were sort of at the heart of their philosophy are the so-called Analytic-Synthetic Distinction and the Verifiability theory of meaning. So let's start with the Analytic-Synthetic Distinction. An analytic proposition are propositions that are true or false in nature of their meaning alone. So the standard example here is, all bachelors are unmarried men. This is true not because of some state of the world. If I asked you, how do you know all bachelors are unmarried men? You don't have to go out and perform a scientific experiment to determine whether or not this is true. This is something that you can know simply by reflecting on the meaning of the words bachelor, unmarried, men, and so forth. If you understand what these words mean, you will understand that this sentence is true, regardless of whether or not there are any bachelors in the world. You could kill every single bachelor in the world. You could kill every single human being in the world, and it would still be true that all bachelors are unmarried men. But, and here's the crucial thing for the positivists, this is not a truth about the world. This is a truth that's true only of words. It's what Hume calls a relation of ideas. And so that's there to be contrasted with synthetic propositions. Synthetic propositions are ones that are true or false in virtue of how the world is. So, for example, all bachelors are bald. That's a synthetic proposition. That one happens to be false, of course. There are plenty of bachelors who are not bald. But the only way you could know that is if you go out into the world and look at bachelors. You could not know that simply by reflecting on the meanings of the words themselves. You have to actually investigate the world. So mathematical statements of pure logic, fall under analytic propositions, and empirical and scientific statements fall under the synthetic propositions. So the analytic propositions that are true, we don't need science for, but they're not about the world. They're simply about relations of ideas. It's the synthetic propositions that are true or false about the world. And by distinguishing these two, we can solve a lot of sort of traditional problems that old school empiricism ran into. This distinction does an awful lot of work for the positivists. So again, remember those claims I talked about, 2 + 2 = 4. Triangles have 3 sides. The rationalists thought these were innate ideas. You didn't need to test them. You didn't learn these through experience. You know them simply by virtue of reason and reason itself. The positivists can sort of get around this problem now. It may be the case that 2 + 2 = 4, independent of how the world is. It may be the case that we don't need to test this empirically. This can look like a problem for empiricism, because if all knowledge comes from experience of the world and 2 + 2 = 4 is true independent of how the world is, how do we reconcile this? Well, now we've got a way around it. This sort of claim is analytic. It's true by definition. It's a stipulation. It's a convention. It's not something that's sort of in our heads from birth. It's something that we invent in order to talk about things that we do experience. How do we make sense of the idea that, again, that we have 2 bananas in your right hand and 2 bananas in your left hand? You have 4 bananas total. We invent this language to talk about these experiences in the abstract. But that doesn't mean that these abstractions are true about some aspect of the world. So truths of mathematics, truths of logic are not fundamental metaphysical facts, according to the positivists. They are conventions that we come and put together as a linguistic community in order to parse the experiences that we have in the world. Turning now to that second core idea of the positivist, the verifiability theory of meaning. Now, a theory of meaning is one of the most difficult parts of any philosophy of language. How do words get their meaning? So take 2 statements, for example. Water is blue and agua es azul. My Spanish is pretty rusty, but I hope I got close enough on that. Typically, we want to say that those 2 statements mean the same thing. One is in English, one is in Spanish, but they mean the same thing. Any world in which water is blue is true. Agua es azul will also be true. You can't have a world in which one is true and the other is not true. They have the same meaning. But what exactly do we mean by that? What does it mean to say that they have the same meaning? And this is something where Plato says there has to be a world independent of the physical world, a world of the forms where these sorts of statements get their meaning from. And so we need some sort of metaphysical realm, a realm of ideas that's detached from the physical world in order to make sense of this, according to Plato. Aha! But now the logical positivists can rebut this. They have an alternate theory. According to the positivists, the meaning of a sentence just is the means by which you verify that statement. So if you look at water and you see that water is blue, then that's what it means to say water is blue. Anytime you look at water, you will see that it's blue. Of course, it's not true that water is blue in all circumstances. It's only blue in some circumstances, but you get the idea. Set that sort of complication aside. Now, if in principle there is no way to verify a statement, if nothing you do can connect that statement to some sort of experience, then it's not just that statement is false. That statement has no meaning at all. So if I say something like the absolute spirit transcends all human consciousness, that's the sort of thing that Hegel might say, how do I verify that? What experience can I point to show that the absolute spirit transcends human consciousness? It doesn't seem like there's anything at all that I could do to verify that. So for the positivists, these sorts of Hegelian sentiments aren't false. They are not even false. They don't rise to the level of being false. They're not the kind of statements that can be false or true. They're just meaningless. They are the epistemological equivalent of flar flar narga 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 narga. That symbol of that string of sounds has no meaning at all. And in principle, that's exactly the same kind of status that they want to give to these statements about absolute spirit and these other sorts of metaphysical pronouncements that people like Plato and Descartes put forward. So that's all that water is blue means. If we look at water, we'll see that it's blue. So only statements that are testable have any meaning at all. And experience, thus, is the only source of knowledge and the only source of meaning. This is the only place that language and sentences and proposition can derive any meaning from experience, from testing. Return now to that problem of external world skepticism I talked about in the last video. This problem of how do I know that the world out there really is the way it appears to me in here, inside my head? This was a problem for classical empiricism. The logical positivists have a way of getting around this totally. They say all talk of external world is just meaningless. There's no such thing as the external world versus the internal world. There is just the world that we experience. There is no distinction to be made between the internal and the external, because no possible experience could verify any distinctions between the two. That was the whole point. But if there is no discernible difference, no testable difference between the internal and the external world, then this sort of talk is just nonsense. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important legacies of the logical positivist movement. Despite the fact that a lot of what they did ends up being rejected, this is something that I think we should hold on to. I personally believe this distinction between the internal and the external world causes an awful lot of confusion for philosophers, and has at least since René Descartes, if not since Plato, and that the sort of suggestion that the positivists are making here really is an excellent way around these kinds of problems. Sadly, the verifiability theory of meaning is not going to be the way to do it, as we're going to see some serious problems with the verifiability theory of meaning. But nonetheless, that conclusion that they wanted to draw is, I think, a very wise conclusion, and I want to keep that in mind later on down the road. Now, an important distinction should be noted here. It's a distinction that the positivists made between two categories of statements. We have, on the one hand, observational statements, things like water is blue, for example. And then we have theoretical statements. Now, theoretical statements are abstractions from observational statements. So, again, an observational statement might be something like the number of the allele frequency in this subspecies is XYZ and so forth. And then you put together a whole bunch of observational statements like that, and from that you put together a sort of more theoretical statement, which would be something like Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, the positivists wanted to hold on to theoretical statements, obviously because theory is an important part of science. If all we had in science was observation, no theory, we'd be in trouble. So they wanted to hold on to theoretical statements, but exactly how we draw the distinction between observation statements and theoretical statements is kind of messy, and it's where we'll start to see some of the cracks in logical positivism. So think about, what exactly do we mean by observation, for example? Do observations have to be with the naked eye? Because in science, we augment our observational capacities in all sorts of ways. We use tools like a telescope, for example, and a microscope. Is that an observation? Is that fair? Is that kosher? You're probably inclined to say it is, but how far can we stretch this idea? Once we get down to things like an electron microscope, well, it starts to get fuzzy whether or not these things are actually sort of count as observations. So can we observe an electron? And now it seems pretty clear we cannot directly observe an electron. Electrons are smaller than a wavelength of light, which is what we need, of course, to see. And of course, they're smaller than our nerve fibers, so we can't actually feel them and so forth. So while we can't see an electron, we can see the consequences of electrons. Ditto with things like black holes. We can't sort of observe them directly, but we can see light bending around them and so forth and so on. Does this count as an observation? Do we want to say that statements about electrons and black holes qualify as observation statements, or do we want to say they qualify as theoretical statements? It's not at all really clear, and the positivists had a sort of a bit of a falling out over exactly how to draw this distinction. Now, another important distinction for the positivists that's worth belaboring for a moment is the context of discovery and the context of justification. Now, scientists don't always discover their ideas in what we think of as a sort of purely scientific fashion. Sometimes they come about their ideas in ways that are, quite frankly, rather romantic. They might rely on sort of aesthetic judgments. So one example here, Einstein said that he knew his theory of relativity was true long before he had any sort of empirical test of the theory of relativity, because, I'm quoting him here, it was so beautiful, it must be true. That was the way Einstein approached it. There are other examples in the history of philosophy, the history of science that I could point to here, but I hope the basic idea is quite clear. Typically, you don't think about scientists talking about ideas being beautiful. You think about them talking about experiments and evidence and so forth. The idea of beauty doesn't normally, it seems, enter into scientific discussion. So the positivists wanted to say, well, this sort of aesthetic judgment makes perfect sense in the context of discovery, when we're looking at where the ideas come from. But what legitimizes science is not how the ideas are discovered. What legitimizes scientific ideas is how they are verified. So no matter how beautiful Einstein's ideas were, they weren't really scientific until they were tested, until Arthur Eddington saw that eclipse and he saw light bend around the sun. Only once we got to that point that we tested and verified the general theory of relativity, that those ideas sort of officially qualified as scientific according to the positivists. Prior to that, they were interesting speculations, they were interesting ideas, but they were not yet scientific. They were not yet verified. So the positivists really basically wanted to set aside the context of discovery. They had no real interest in the history of science or in the history of philosophy because the context of discovery didn't really matter to them. What they cared about was the context of justification. Biography, how scientists come about their ideas, that didn't interest them. What they wanted to know was, once the ideas were on the table, how did we verify them? How did we test them? That's what they were principally focused on. And again, that might sound appealing to you, but as we go on in the next few videos, I hope we'll see why this is actually kind of a myopic focus. The context of discovery requires a fair amount of attention if we're fully going to understand how science works as a whole. We can't just ignore this context.